Mr. President.
The senator from New Mexico.
Thank you, Mr. President, for the recognition, and I thank Senator Gardner for his hard work on this excellent piece of legislation. Mr. President, today our nation is in pain. It is the pain of centuries of deeply embedded racial injustice. This nation has watched in horror as the last 8 minutes and 46 seconds of George Floyd's life were cruelly and needlessly taken from him by a police officer. Our nation grieves for the families of Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and so many other innocent black men and women violently taken from their families and loved ones. This is a pain all too familiar for too many black Americans. And this is a moment of reckoning for our nation. Black Americans have borne the brunt of this systemic racism, as have Hispanic and Native American communities in New Mexico and across the nation. So many of our officers protect and serve with honor and integrity. But we cannot continue to sweep police brutality and racial inequality under the rug, ignoring these painful legacies until the next tragedy. There are thousands of Americans of every political stripe across the nation who have come out in peaceful protest, demanding change. Now, we know there are a very small few, who are exploiting our nation's pain and using violence to disrupt. We unequivocally condemn all acts of violence and call for nonviolent but urgent action. By calling for the U.S. military to quell protest, as the President and some in this body have done, that crosses a line between civilian and military rule that is antithetical to American traditions. Instead of calling for American soldiers to repress their fellow citizens exercising their First Amendment rights, I'm calling for actions of this body. Today, Senators Booker and Harris introduced the Justice in Policing Act, a bill I'm proud to co-sponsor. This landmark bill holds policemen misconduct accountable in courts of law, shines a light on the police practices requiring transparency, and ends racial profiling and mandates racial bias training, bans chokeholds and requires body cams and makes lynching a federal crime. This is a moment of reckoning for our nation. I call upon the Senate majority to join with us to pass this long overdue legislation as soon as possible. And I would ask, Mr. President, that my speech that I'm going to talk in the Great American Heirs Act have consent to put it someplace else in the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I'd now like to turn to the bill before us, the Great American Outdoors Act. Our country's public lands are at the very core of our national identity. They protect our natural heritage, our lands and waters, our wildlife for future generations. Our national parks, monuments, and wildlife refuges are irreplaceable treasures, sources of beauty, of solitude, of recreation, and of renewal. From the Grand Canyon to Stonewall National Monument to the city park in our neighborhood, our public lands sustain our people. And we owe it to these special places and to ourselves and to our children to sustain them for the future. So today, Mr. President, I stand here in strong support of the Great American Outdoors Act, legislation that, at long last, fully and permanently funds the Land and Water Conservation Fund and invests in our public lands for the future. The Land and Water Conservation Fund was passed in 1964. My father, Stuart Udall, was Secretary of Interior at the time, and I'm proud he helped establish the LWCF. As Secretary, he was troubled by how difficult it was to expand public lands. And at that time, the federal government would redesignate existing federal lands to create a new national park or a new wildlife refuge, or rely on private donations to expand. But the Congress itself resisted appropriating funds to create new public lands. At a wilderness conference in 1963, my father bluntly said, and I quote here, "The path of land conservation that our government has used for more than half a century is running into a dead end." But he had conceived of a new path forward, an entirely new watershed in the history of the conservation movement in the United States, he told them. Just 3 weeks before the conference, President Kennedy had sent Congress a new piece of legislation called the Land and Water Conservation Fund Act. My father and others conceived of a federal fund that would both generate money to acquire new federal lands and provide states with funding to expand recreational opportunities. The bill passed Congress the next year. The LWCF has been called our nation's most successful conservation program. It's wildly popular with the American people and has touched every corner of our nation. In rural and urban areas with parks, forests, wildlife refuges, trails, wild and scenic river corridors, historic monuments, and cultural sites. LWCF has funded 42,000 stateside projects. In my home state alone, it has helped over 1,200 such projects found in every one of our 33 counties. After the LWCF was enacted, it became clear that the initial funding sources were too limited. My father persuaded President Johnson to support using federal revenues from oil and gas leases in the outer continental shelf to fund the program. His plan converted revenue from a non-renewable source into a permanent protection for our renewable natural world. And while Congress amended the act to include this funding source and later authorized the fund to actually accrue $900 million, the full promise of LWCF was not yet fulfilled. Throughout my career, I've championed increases to the LWCF, but it deserves the dedicated funding my father and many others envisioned. Last year, Congress finally permanently authorized the fund, a historic victory for conservation. It is long past time we take the next step and permanently direct the full $900 million to the fund every year. Not only has LWCF met its conservation mission 100 times over, it's helped fuel the outdoor recreation economy, support local economies, especially in rural areas throughout the nation. Since the creation of the fund, the outdoor industry has grown tremendously. It is now an $887 billion industry that powers 7.6 million jobs. That includes nearly 100,000 direct jobs in New Mexico, driving $2.8 billion in wages and nearly $10 billion in consumer spending. Fully and permanently funding LWCF will translate directly into economic growth. And we need to energize our economy now more than ever as we work our way out of the financial crisis created by COVID-19. Throughout our history, we've been investing in public lands that energize both our economy and our national spirit. Conservation must be a centerpiece of our recovery at this challenging time for our nation. Indeed, the economic benefits of the LWCF are great, but the human benefits to ourselves, our families, and our communities may be greater. One of the most recent LWCF projects in New Mexico is the Valle del Oro National Wildlife Refuge, the first urban wildlife refuge in the Southwest. Here's a photograph of our state's newest refuge, the Valle del Oro. The Rio Grande runs along this refuge, which boasts an amazing array of wild birds, including sandhill cranes, which you see here, the greater roadrunner, and the American kestrel. This $6 million contribution from the Land and Water Conservation Fund helped make the vision of this urban oasis a reality. Valle de Oro is special to me because it introduces young people, often Hispanic young people with limited means and limited access to nature, to their first outdoor experience. It introduces kids to a world of wonder and a lifetime of connection to nature, and it's just down the street. As Richard Louv discussed so eloquently in his seminal book, Last Child in the Woods, and backed up with peer-reviewed study after study, our children need nature, and we suffer spiritually and physically when that bond is lost. So as we take this historic action to add to our national heritage, I'm glad we are also addressing the $19 billion worth of deferred maintenance on our existing public lands. Like the other days of the Civilian Conservation Corps, this work is especially timely and will help our economic recovery at a time of historic unemployment. It's good news that use of our public lands has increased so dramatically over time. More than 1 billion visitors enjoy our federal public lands each year. The infrastructure on these public lands, our roads, bridges, and trails, our campgrounds, marinas, our drinking water and sewer systems are wearing out. Historic buildings are falling apart, trails are washed out, roads and bridges can't be used, water lines and sewer systems don't function. The list is long, $19 billion long. In New Mexico alone, we have $121 million worth of deferred maintenance needed at iconic places like Carlsbad Caverns, White Sands National Park, Chaco Cultural National Historical Park, the Gila Cliff Dwellings, and Bandelier National Monument. The Great American Outdoors Act represents a substantial down payment towards maintaining, repairing, and renovating the infrastructure on our public lands, allocating up to $1.9 billion annually for 5 years. This represents Congress's most significant commitment to date to the long-term future of our public lands. The American people own these precious resources. We need to maintain the American people's public spaces so that all of us can continue to safely and enjoyably visit these special places. How we take care of these public places says a lot about our nation. Mr. President, our nation's conservation heritage is uniquely American. The bill before us strengthens our nation's commitment to conservation, to protecting our wild places, to preserving our history and cultures, and to nurturing our bonds with nature and the great outdoors. I urge every member here to wholeheartedly support our heritage and vote in favor of this bill. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
The senator from Montana.
I ask consent that I be allowed to finish my remarks.